Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Chullin Daf Samach Zayin, and very exciting, we're going to finish the third parak, Elu Trefot, of Masechet Chullin. A very long parak and not an easy one. I will not say that today's stuff will be fascinating, but we will finish the chapter. So there you have, that's what's going for you for today. Okay, we're going to go back to, and this is really our topic for today, these creatures that were created by spontaneous generation in a vessel, right? We said if there's water in a vessel, you can drink it. You don't have to be worried. Mishum, if you remember, there's shratzim, and this is a good introduction to today's stuff. There's creatures that you're not allowed to eat. There's shratzim in the water, right, which are basically fish without fins and scales. And there's creatures on the land. Okay, we're going to get to those also. Okay, and those are forbidden. So now we're talking about anything that's basically spontaneously generated. We're going to say let's say water in a vessel is not going to be a problem. You don't need to check for fins and scales. And what we learned in the braita yesterday is that is both satum and meforash. It was explicitly stated in a pasuk, that's meforash. It was also implicitly learned from a pasuk, and that's satum. Today we're going to figure out which pasuk is it satum, which pasuk is it meforash. But we're going to get there soon. In the meantime, what we learned is that where do we get this from really? Which kind of leads to the satum and the meforash, but we'll get there later. Because the verse about the snapir and kaskeset was specifically talking about yamim unichalim, in the streams and the seas. Okay, which means not in, right? We said that includes ni'itzim v'charitzim. It excludes water in a vessel. And then we said, what about the in-between? Right? There were 4 sections. There's water in a vessel. Then we get to bor shiach u'ma'ara, right? If it's in a pit, a ditch, or a cave, which is like a cistern that's sort of covered cistern, like with an opening in the side, basically like a cave. Water that collects there. So how do we know that? That's from the words et zetochlu. Okay, from the beginning of the pasuk it said, and this is what you should eat, which didn't need to say that because the end of the pasuk said you should eat. So we learn it from both those. And then we explain that basically why are we including ni'itzim and charitzim, which are pools with running water or channels with running water, narrow channels, which aren't the same as seas and streams, but they are included. And that's basically because of a klal pratu klal, because it says water. It says streams and seas and streams, and it also says water. Even though we ended by saying, well, it's not exactly in that order. It says water, then seas and streams. But we ended with this opinion in Israel that they hold that you can do a klal prat in that way anyway. It doesn't have to be klal prat klal, right? Which again, if you do klal prat klal, what it means is that you're going to not only include things that are exactly like the prat, but even a little wider you're going to go, okay? Which includes also the water that's streaming. So now we're going to read the klal prat klal in detail. How does it work, even though I kind of just said it and we already knew it from the page before, but they're going to spell it out. We're starting from the second line of today's daf. B'mayim klal, b'yamim u'b'nechalim prat, b'mayim chazar v'kalal. So we have general, then specific, then general. Again, even though it's not the order, but we're going to view it as if it's the order. Klal prat klal. The way a klal prat klal works is iatadan ela ke'ena prat. We learn that it's anything similar to the prat. Ma prat meforash mayim novim. What typifies seas and streams that the water is moving? Af kol mayim novim. Right. So any water that's moving. My rabbi. So what are we including? Charitzim v'ni'itzim. Right. This is just review. It's just putting it into the klal prat klal format. What does it include? Charitzim v'ni'itzim. That's the pools and the channels. Li surah, to be forbidden. Umay mi'ed. And what does it exclude? Borot shichin u'ma'arot lehetera. Okay, and then we're going to see that all the sitting water, right, whether it's in a bor, a shiach, or a ma'ara, is going to be permitted. So now they say ve'ema, but why don't you could say it's like the prat and include in the prohibition the bor, shiach, and ma'ara. How so? We could say, ema ma prat beforash mayim gedelim al gabe karka. Maybe it's any water that's on the ground, okay, that's basically has a floor to it, as opposed to in a vessel. And maybe you would say, af kol mayim gedelim al gabe karka, just like the sea and the stream is on ground, right? Also, the bor shiach ha'ma'ara, it's on the ground. It's not in a vessel, so my rabbi, and then you would include afilu borot shichin u'ma'arot li'surah. They would actually be forbidden, that water, right? Again, to drink without checking that there's no creature that doesn't have fins and scales on it. Umay mi'et kelim. And what are you excluding? You're excluding just vessels, just water in vessels, which are not on the ground, right? The water's not on the ground there. It's in a vessel. Well, what's the reason? Because in kain tochlu maya hanele. Well, then what is the word etzeh tochlu? In other words, again, what do we have? We have a klal upratu klal, which excludes something. And then we have that verse etzeh tochlu, which also excludes something. So we have to have two exclusions. So if we excluded only the water in the vessel, then there would be no need for those first few words, which says, and this is what you should eat, which is an additional term, which is coming to say there's something additional you can eat. If we basically say everything else can't be eaten, then you're going to be stuck with only one exclusion, and that doesn't make any sense, because we have two ways to exclude. One is the klal prat klal, which includes, but by including, it's also excluding only things that are like the prat. So it's going to exclude the water in the bor shiach, or we're going to say the water in the vessel. And then we're going to have the first words, etzeh tochlu, this you can eat, which is including some additional thing you can eat, is the bor shiach ha'ma'ara. Okay? Or you could say, that's the bor shiach ha'ma'ara, and the right from the klal upratu klal, and the etzeh tochlu is coming to say water in the vessel. Okay? So you needed something to be, telling it that. Okay, or somewhere for those words to be going. Now we're going to say, debate Rabbi Yishmael Tana. Now, in the school of Rabbi Yishmael, in his Beit Midrash, they had a different way to darshan. And instead of employing, they say b'mayim shtei pamim. It says mayim twice. Ein zeh klal uprat. This is not a klal uprat. Ela riba umi'et. If you might remember, that we've learned that there's these different types. There's riboy and miut, which is always including more than the klal uprat. It's the same idea. It's that there's a word that's talking about more things, right? General. And then there's specific words. So, in general, we're going to say, right, there's two different ways of using this kind of drasha. And in the school of Rabbi Yishmael, at least in this case, and I say that on purpose because it's a little bit tricky to say this, to say that Rabbi Yishmael employs riboy and miut all the time would be difficult because, remember the shloshis, Rabbi Yishmael Omer, that's part of our davening every day, but shloshis midot Torah nidresha behem, and one of them is klal uprat, klal uprat klal, and he doesn't use riboy and miut there. It's not in that list. So how is the school of Rabbi Yishmael using riboy and miut? And then if we say, well, he always uses it, that's just not true. So either you can distinguish between Rabbi Yishmael and his students, that's a possibility, because this is debate Rabbi Yishmael, and that's Rabbi Yishmael himself, and maybe his students veered and decided to use this. Some people say that maybe it's in this particular case because we have a weird klal uprat klal, because this is mayim, and then yamim unechalim. So maybe because it's a different type of klal uprat, so maybe you could still, maybe he didn't agree with the Israeli rabbis and said you could do klal uprat here, but he did think you could do riboy and miut here. Or maybe sometimes he employs it and sometimes he uses klal uprat. Okay, I'm just kind of raising it as a bit of a question in case you were thinking about it. There's people give different explanations. But in any case, let's see what he does. Now, in the end, it's going to be the same. It's just he's using a different method. Okay, often when they use a different method, they actually get to different conclusions. This one doesn't really seem very different. So it's not klal uprat, it's riboy miut. B'mayim riba. B'yamim u'b'nechalim mi'et. Chazar v'riba. Riba u'mi'et riba hakol. Okay, so again, we have mayim is a riboy. Yamim u'nechalim is a miut. Mayim again is a riboy. Again, it's the same thing as a klal uprat. It's just usually including more things. My rabbe, charitzim v'niyitzim li'isura, umay mi'eh, barot shechinu ma'arot lehetera. So what's forbidden? Charitzim v'niyitzim. What's permitted? The bor shiach ma'ara, right? The standing water. Ema, why don't you say, umay riba, barot shechinu ma'arot li'isura? So now we're going to ask the exact same question. And here it's even a stronger question, because once you go into the riboy v'miut territory, you're usually mirabet many more things. So it just has to be a little similar to it, right? If we go in a scale, klal uprat, it has to be really like the prat. Klal uprat to klal, it gets to be a little more general. Riboy mi'eh v'riboy, it's really more general. Umay mi'eh kelim. Okay, so why don't you say that? And then the miut is only water in the vessel. And we're going to end the same way as the last time, which is in kain tochlu maya hanile. Well, then in the end, you're going to have, what are you doing with the word tochlu? And that's not going to work. Now they suggest a very strange suggestion, v'ipochana. Why don't we say the bor shiach and the mara is what's forbidden, and the charitzim and niyitzim is what's permitted. Okay, and that maybe you could drink water from the charitzim and niyitzim. Why they're suggesting this, I'm not really sure, because the answer is quite obvious, and that's what they're going to say right now. Kidetane matitya, as Matitya says, which is, as he brought a braita that said, Detane matitya bar Yehuda, mai ra'ita l'rabot barot shechinu ma'arot lehetera, Ulotzi charitzim unitzim lisura. Okay, why was that the direction that you went? Well, marbe ani barot shichinu marot shehem atzurim kekelim. They're much more similar to a vessel because they're standing waters. They're collected in one area, as opposed to motzi ani charitzim unitzim shehem atzurim kekelim. And the running water, right, is not standing. It's not like in a vessel, and that's why that would be obvious to go the other way. Okay, so we end up with these two methods, which is very interesting that they bring two different methods because in the end they both come to the exact same conclusion. Okay, but again, it's just, I guess, important to see the different methods employed to get there. Hey satum v'hem beforash. Now we have to get back to the braita that we read yesterday, where the braita said, listen, ho'il, I'm just going to go back to the words. They asked, what do we do with the words tochlum v'kol asher b'mayim, which in the end we know are coming to include bor shiach ha'me'ara. But they said, ma kashi tir, she'achol, you might have thought, ho'il v'yitir b'mforash v'yitir b'stam, right? Because there's a pasuk where it's explicit that they exclude water in a vessel from this law. And there's one place where it's implicit. It's just implied, it's not clear. That's the satum. So, mak shitir b'mforash lo yitir ela b'kelim, ak shitir b'stam lo yitir ela b'kelim. So why don't we assume then, if just like the heter, where it's clear that it's explicit, is only for water in a vessel, maybe the other one, where it's not so clear and you could just imply it, would also be only water in a vessel, and that would exclude water in the bor shiach ha'me'ara, which is why they said in the end, well, the pasuk at zeh tochlu comes to teach you, right, this you can eat, comes to teach you can eat something additional, which is the bor shiach ha'me'ara. But now we want to know, okay, well, where is it explicit in the pasuk and where is it implicit in the pasuk? So I'm going to remind you of the three pasukim again that we read yesterday. We're going to read them again. In Vayikra chapter 11, verses 9 to 11. Et zeh tochlu, this is what you can eat, mikol asher b'mayim, from everything in the water, kol asher lo snapir v'kaskesen, anything that has fins and scales, b'mayim, in the water, bayamim u'b'nechalim, in the seas and the streams, otam tochelu. Okay, this pasuk you should know pretty well at this point. Second pasuk, v'chol asher ein lo snapir v'kaskesen, and if it doesn't have fins and scales, bayamim u'b'nechalim, in the seas and the streams. Notice both psukim use the words in the seas and the streams. That's what's going to be important here. Mikol sheretz hamayim, from all creatures that are in the water. Mikol nefesh chaya asher b'mayim, or any creatures in the water. Sheketz lachem, it's despicable to you. Sheketz you lachem, and for you it should be despicable. It's a little bit weird why that repeats. We're not going to get into that today. Mibsaram lo tochelu ve'nivlatam tishaketzu. Okay, the main thing being here, don't eat them. Okay, so between pasuk 10 and 11, it says anything that doesn't have fins and scales, you shouldn't eat. Now, both psukim talked about streams, right? Seas and streams. So now they say, which is satum? Which pasuk do you think is very clear that we're not talking about water in the vessel? And which pasuk is it not as clear, but yet you can infer it? Pligi bar Ravacha v'Ravina. Okay, machloket, chad amar yeshlo is the meforash pasuk. Ve'ein lo satum. Yeshlo means the pasuk that's the first pasuk, which says if it has fins and scales, you can eat it if it's in the seas and the streams. Or ein lo is the pasuk which says, and if it doesn't have fins and scales, you can't eat it. Okay? So one said yeshlo meforash. The first pasuk is where it's explicit. Ein lo satum, and the second place is where it's implicit. V'chad amar, and the other one obviously said the opposite. Ein lo meforash v'yeshlo satum. Okay, now we have to understand. My time a demanda amar yesh lo meforash, amar le minehu dekamishtaru kelim. Okay, this doesn't really help you. It says because from there it's very clear that kelim are permitted. Now, why is it not? Why is it so clear to them they don't even need to bother telling you? Because look at the pasuk. The pasuk basically says this is what you should eat, right? When it says what you need to eat, right? When you can eat, you need to eat fish that have fins and scales. It says, this is what you should eat, and the two words before it are, in the seas and the streams. That seems to say, this is completely irrelevant if it's in a vessel, because it's definitely not a sea and stream, and that's where it says, and those you should eat. Okay, meaning you need to check for fins and scales only if it's in a sea or a stream, not if it's water in a vessel. That's where it's explicit. That's where it's very clear. The other pasuk, I want you to notice the distance between yamim and nechalim and the words don't eat. The words don't eat appear in the next pasuk. Remember, in pasuk 11, not in pasuk 10. In pasuk 10 it says, anything that's napir b'kaskazet bayamim u'nechalim. Notice the yamim u'nechalim appear in the first part of the pasuk. And then there's the whole rest of the pasuk. And then only in the middle of the next pasuk it says, mibsaram lo tochelu. So there's a big gap between don't eat and anything that doesn't have fins and scales in the water and the sea. So because of the distance between them, that by the time you get to don't eat them, maybe it's don't eat them at all, even if they're in water in a vessel. And therefore, in the end, they say, well, it does say yamim nechalim, so it is implicit, but it's just not clear cut. Okay, and that's the satum. My time of demand amar ein lo meforash. Okay, what about the one who says the opposite? The ein lo pasuk is where it's very clear, and the first pasuk it's not really so clear, and that's because we actually said this yesterday, because the dehaihu dekamoche chaheach. Because the second pasuk proves the way to read the first pasuk. Okay? Without the second pasuk, you might have read the first pasuk differently. What might you have thought? Di'imehach, if you just had the first pasuk, you would have said, Havamina bekelim avagav di'itle nami lo techo. You might have said like this. What does it say in the first pasuk? This is what you should eat. If it has fins and scales in the seas and the streams, then you can eat it. What might you say? Well, if it's not in the seas and the streams, maybe you can't eat it even if it has fins and scales. Okay, maybe it's worse in the vessel. Comes the second pasuk and says, no, if it doesn't have fins and scales, you can't eat it if it's in the seas and the streams, which makes it very clear then you can't eat it if it's not in the seas and the streams, even if it doesn't have fins and scales. And that's why the second pasuk is actually the explicit pasuk, and the second and the third. And the first pasuk is not. Okay, so there you have two different ways to read it. Amar Rav Huna. Okay, now we're going to go on to something else. It's very similar. Okay, this was shratzim in the water, and shratzim in the water, basically, if they're fish, they need fins and scales. If they're not in live water, right, they're in water in a vessel, or even water in a pit cistern or cave cistern or a ditch, then you're okay, and you don't have to worry about these because they're not included in the prohibition of the shratzim in the water that need fins and scales, which we just proved. Now, what we have to figure out is there's shratzim on the aretz, okay? And this goes back to what we talked about, spontaneous generation yesterday, because they believed that there were creatures, right? So the whole reason for this, and that's why this is a complete, a very smooth transition into the next section, is the whole reason why we said, and I forgot to mention this in the beginning of the class today, but we talked about this yesterday, is that anything in the water, or they even thought in the pits and all that, that the creatures there were generated within that water there. And that's not what we're concerned for, okay? Now, in the shratzim, okay, there was this concern also that there were these, in general, they thought that shratzim were created by spontaneous generation, right? And again, if it was spontaneous generation and they were never in the water, in the big sea, right, it's just not a problem. So here also, it says, sheretz hashoretz ala aretz. A sheretz that crawls, a creature that crawls on the ground. Only creatures that crawl on the ground. If they were spontaneously generated in a fruit, in something else, we're even going to get to in animals or fish, okay, we're going to end the daf with that. If they were spontaneously generated in something else and never actually went on the ground, they're not prohibited. So if they come out of the fruit and they crawl on the ground, then they're prohibited, okay? Because at this point, they were sheretz hashoretz ala aretz, right? They're crawling on the ground. But if they were created, now, if they're in a fruit, we actually learned this, okay? We had this back on Nun Chet. If you remember, we talked about that a creature doesn't live, like certain creatures, like mosquitoes don't live more than a day, and then we had this whole thing, what about the wine that you wait 12 months, because then you can know. There were all these ways to figure out, but the idea there is that if it was created in it and never was out on the ground, it's basically going to be permitted. Now, if it's in a fruit, let's say a worm or something like that, or a bug that was in the fruit, but first crawled on the ground and then went into the fruit, that's a different story. So, how you figure out, that's a good question, and there's certain things to help you figure that out. But if you can assume that it was created in this fruit and never went on the ground, it's not prohibited. Today we're going to get to, well, where do we draw the line? When is it considered that it went on the ground? maybe even before it physically crawled on the ground, maybe when it was potentially able to. We're going to talk about this. We're going to actually ask a slew of questions and not have answers to them. Okay, that's going to be the gray area. But if it was created in this vessel and never crawled on the ground or even came out in this fruit or something like that, then it's not a problem. Okay, it's similar to the water in the vessel. It's the same idea. It's just there it's water. Here we're talking about creatures on the ground. So Amar Rav Huna. Rav Huna therefore says, Lo lishvi inish shichra b'tzviyata be'orta. Don't put your, okay, now what they would do is they would take their beer, which was made from dates. Now dates potentially had creepy crawlers in them, okay? Things that were potentially, right, bugs or creatures or insects or worms that were created inside. So now we're going to say like this. Don't pour your beer. They would take the beer, which had the dates in it, and they would pour it onto tzviyata, straw, and from there it would go, right, this would be a way to sift it, or to, what's the word, to sift, not sift, you would call it, I don't remember, but okay, but you would put it on this straw, or to at night, to strain it, thank you, that was the word. They would strain it, and don't put it in there at nighttime. What's the concern? Dilma parish la'el mitzviyata v'hadar nafil lakasa. Maybe the worms that are in there will basically, okay, now they'll go on the straw. Now going on the straw will be like, what will it be like? It's like going on the ground. And if it goes on the straw first, and then because it's straw, it can kind of creep down into the vessel that you're, straining the beer into, and then it'll go, instead of just, beforehand it's in the beer, and it's not a problem because it never went on the ground, but at this point it'll go on the ground first and then go right back into the beer. Now don't do it at night because you won't see the worms. If you do it during the day, you can watch and see, are there any worms, and were there any worms that were on the straw and then went down into the beer, into the cup. So if it goes on this straw first, okay, and then it will be a problem because it will be like it was on the ground. The straw covering there, it's using for the strainer, that's being used for the strainer, is like going on the ground. So then they say, ihachi, if that's the case, b'mananami. Even if it's just in the vessel, without having strained it, it should be a problem. Why? Well, if you're worried that maybe it was first, right, it went from the beer, which was okay. It was okay when it was there, onto the straw. From there into the vessel. Well, in that same note, if it's in the same vessel the whole time, you should still be concerned. Because why? Dilma parish le dafna demana v'hadra nafa lamana. Maybe at some point it will crawl up out of the beer and hang out on the wall of the vessel and then go back into the beer. And won't that be like sheretz hasharetz ala aretz? To which the Gemara says, no. Going on the straw on its way into the vessel is not the same as climbing up on the side of the walls of the vessel. Because hatam hainu revite, that's where it generates. In other words, in this vessel, you're still in the same vessel, and that doesn't really matter. Okay, that's its locale, basically. And that's not a problem. That's not considered something, the strainer there is something external. This is not external. Umanate, now how do we know that that's not considered something external? Because Titania, minayin lerabot borot shichin u'ma'arot, sheshoche v'shoteh mehem ve'eno nimna. Well, let's go back, and now we see the connection. Okay, if it wasn't somewhat connected with this idea anyway, but now they're going to say, look at our issue there. What did we say? Bul, shiach u'ma'ara, pit, ditch, cistern, right? Cave cistern. Sheshoche, by the way, shoche I translated wrong last time. Shoche is to dig. Okay, that you dig out. In other words, you can dig up. When you dig up in one of these things, you're going to dig up water, and you can drink the water. Shoteh mehem ve'eno nimna. You don't have to worry about it. How do we know that? That's just a repeat of the drasha. What does that have to do with anything? Well, why don't we say maybe at some point the creature went up on the side of the cistern or the ditch or the cave and wasn't actually in the water, moved away from it for a minute and then came back, right? So you shouldn't be able to, even if theoretically you could eat it because you say, well, that's where it was created, but it's a problem because if it goes out and back in, shouldn't that be a problem? So what do you see here? Elahainu revite. So just like we said before, right, that's where it was created. This is its natural habitat. Hachanami, hainu ravite. We could say the same thing, just like here. We can bring it back to the previous case of the beer in a barrel, where we don't have to worry that it went up on the wall of the barrel and back inside. That's not a problem. So again, worms in beer is fine, but don't strain it at night where you won't see if perhaps the worm first got onto the strainer, and then you have to worry about it. Okay, you have to eliminate today, although we will see one case where somebody addresses it, the idea of this is disgusting that you're eating worms or other creatures and things like that, right? But they seem to say in these cases, right, it's crazy to think that they actually think this is all permitted, right? When we know we're so careful about insects and worms and all that, okay? But here they seem to be very lenient. Amalei Rav Chisda le Rav Huna. Now Rav Huna was the one who said this. Don't do this at night with your strainer. So Rav Chisda says to Rav Huna, Tanya de B'se'alach, I'm going to bring a braita to support what you have to say. Kol hasheretz hashoretz ala haaretz, that's the pasuk, right? Any sheretz, the creature that crawls on the ground. L'rabot yavchushim shesininam. This includes yavchushim, which are like mosquitoes or some kind of insect, that sininam, that was already sifted, okay? Meaning strained. Tama de sininan. Okay, so that's saying it comes to include, okay, you can call these gnats that were strained. Okay, once they're strained, they're a problem. It says gnats that were strained are included in this pasuk. But tama de sininan, halo sininan shari. It sounds like if you didn't strain out the gnats, then it's not a problem. Okay, Amar Shmuel. Now Shmuel says something which we're going to see as a subject of debate. Kishut shehitzliya. If you have, okay, kishut from kishu, which is zucchini, but many people translate as cucumber. Either which way, it's a vegetable. It's growing in the ground. If, while it's still attached to the ground, hitzliya, it gets worm infested. Bi'ibeha means while it's attached to the ground. Asura mishum asheretz hashoretz ala haaretz. It's forbidden because of asheretz hashoretz ala haaretz. Okay? So now we're at the top of a bet, and we're basically learning that Shmuel is telling us that if you have this vegetable that's attached to the ground, and it becomes worm infested. Now, if it becomes worm infested when it's not attached to the ground, like those dates we were talking about in the beer, we're talking about, now again, how you figure this out, that's an excellent question. I don't have an answer to that. How do you know whether they were there earlier or not? The truth is it came up on Nunched a bit, like depends on how much time it's been there, and we had that a little bit. But if you can assume that it didn't happen when it was attached to the ground, but it was there later, then it's fine. But if then, right, because it's not sheretz hashoretz ala haaretz, they were generated inside the fruit and they haven't yet come out. But if it was attached to the ground, well, things that are attached to the ground are considered as if they're on the ground. And therefore, if the creature is there and if it becomes worm infested while it's attached to the ground, that is already a sheretz hashoretz ala haaretz. Okay, because things attached to the ground are considered as if they're in the ground. It's as if the sheretz crawled on the ground, even though it crawled inside this vegetable. But the vegetable is considered on the ground. And we're going to see that we don't only mean things that are physically on the ground, but fruits in a tree. They're attached to the ground. So because they're attached to the ground, anything attached to the ground is considered that the sheretz was already in the ground, and it's forbidden. So Shmuel is machmir in this case. Lema meseale. So now they suggest, let's prove what Shmuel says from here. We're going to bring a contradiction between two sources, and the only way to resolve the contradiction, they're going to say, is to say like Shmuel. One case it's attached to the ground, one case it's not attached to the ground. And then they're going to reject it and say not necessarily, and then we're going to see from that really a different opinion. Ditanechada, one braita says, ala haaretz, when it says asheretz hashoretz ala haaretz, lotzi et hazizin sheba adashim. Okay, zizin in adashim are some sort of, again, insect that's in lentils. Ve'et hayetushim sheba kalisim, these are mosquitoes in beans. V'tolat shebitmarim, and worms in dates. And shebigor growth, and in figs. Okay, so we're going to say, ala haaretz comes to exclude all these things. If you have adashim, now all these things are attached to the ground, basically, or could be attached to the ground, right? So if you find these insects in lentils, or you find the mosquitoes in the beans, you find the worms in the fruits, it's a problem. V'tanya idach, a different braita says, kol asheretz hashoretz ala haaretz, l'rabot tolat shebikarei zeitim, v'shebikarei gfanim. Now, the previous pasuk said it had to be ala haaretz, and that excludes all these cases. This pasuk says, all shratzim, kol sheretz, and that includes tolat should be karei zeitim. So the worm that's in the, now it's a little hard to understand what this word is, ikarei zeitim, okay, ikarei kfanim, but basically it sounds like it's in the olives and in the vines. Okay, ikarei are often like the roots or the branches or the like the trunk. Okay, but it's not really clear right now, and they assume that we're talking about tolaim in the olives and tolaim in the vines, which really means in the grapes. Okay, and then they compare it and they say, "My love, aren't these both talking about the fruits? And if they're talking about the fruits, then how can you say one is a problem and you say the other one isn't a problem?" So they say, "Ha be'ibei, ha shalo be'ibei." It must be that when they said in ikarei zeitim and ikarei kfanim, which sounds like they're attached to the ground, right? Because it's talking about either the trunk or the stems, right, or the vines. So it sounds like that must be when they're attached to the ground. And the first situation where we're permitting it is when they're not attached to the ground anymore. If you find them in dates, when they, it became worm infested when the dates were already detached from the ground. And then that would prove Shmuel perfectly. To which the Gemara rejects this, as I told you, and said, "Lo, idi be'ibei, v'lo kashya, habepere, ilana gufa." Now here, this is why I didn't really want to explain ikarei zeitim and ikarei kfanim so well at the start, because it was hard to explain them without giving this answer. Because once you really translate it, you realize it doesn't really mean the fruit itself. And that's why I was being very vague about how to explain it, because you can't really explain it at that point, because the Gemara really understands it as the fruit itself. But they say now, no, you could say that the one that permitted it said it's in the fruit. And the one that forbade it is habi lana gufe, in the tree itself, or in the stems themselves, in the trunk itself, right, in the branches. If it's worm infested in that part, that's forbidden. But if it's in the fruit, it's already not forbidden. In which case that would go against Shmuel. And they further prove it. Aikanami dekatane, the second explanation seems more reasonable. Dekatane tolat shebi ikrei zeitim ubi ikrei kfanim shmamina. The whole word ikrei means in the ikar, in the tree part, in the branches part, in the vine part, not in the fruit. Okay? In which case, they seem to bring this problem now with Shmuel, that this doesn't seem to go with Shmuel, because it seems like fruit's attached to the ground. If it's created in the fruit, it's really not on the ground. Okay, where Shmuel really did think that it was a problem, so we have this debate. Now we're going to start a slew of questions. As I mentioned earlier, what's considered that it's already been on the ground, that it comes out of the fruit and it's already on the ground? So obviously, if it comes out of the fruit and crawls on the ground, that's clearly going to be now forbidden. So even though it was created inside the fruit, but once it comes out and it's crawling on the ground, it's clearly a problem. But now we're going to have all these in-between cases. By Rav Yosef. And the question is, at what stage, right? So things come out of the fruit, and then they, either fly or crawl or get to the ground eventually. So there's going to be a whole slew of cases of things in between being in the fruit, starting to come out of the fruit, right? Or even we'll see where we get, and all the way until it actually crawls on the ground. So, Amar Rav Yosef, Pirsha v'meta mahu. What if it comes out of the fruit and immediately dies? Meaning, it doesn't even have a chance to go crawling on the ground because it's dead already. But on the other hand, it did come out, and maybe that's already, since it could have potentially have gone on the ground at that point, even though it didn't, could have potentially crawled on the ground, maybe that's forbidden. Miktsata mahu. This is like a Rabbi Yirmiyah question, right? What if it's half on the ground, half not on the ground, 2 legs on the ground, 2 legs not, or, depending if it's a 4-legged creature, but, half. Or la'avir ha'olam mahu. What if, now Rashi says this is based on the first question. If you say it came out and immediately died, and then you say it's permitted, because look, it can't crawl on the ground now. But what if it goes out into the air of the world, and what they mean is probably like it started to fly, but didn't yet go on the ground. Now, since it's still alive and could potentially go on the ground, is that enough to be considered that it went on the ground? Because potential, right, we've seen lots of cases, if it could, potentially, sometimes it's as if it did. Teku. We don't have an answer to any of these questions, and neither are we going to have answers to Rav Ashi. So these are Rav Yosef's questions. By Rav Ashi, ligad tmara mahu. Rav Ashi has a whole series of other questions, which is, what if it comes out of the date, but it's sitting on top of the date, the roof of the date? So it's not on the ground, but it did come out of the fruit. Ligad gar'inata mahu. It's even more extreme. What if, now the assumption they say here is that where are these worms generated from? The pit. So what if it comes out of the pit, but it's still in the fruit? So again, it came out of its natural habitat. Maybe that's already a problem. Mitzmara litzmara mahu. What if it crawls from one date to another? So it already left where it was created from, but it never, let's say there's 2 dates right up against each other, it never saw the air of the world, it never got out of dates. Teku. And we have no answers to these questions. So again, it's where do we get from created in the fruit to gone on the ground, it was called on the ground. What about all these in-betweens where theoretically it's already coming out of where it was created, but it's not yet physically on the ground? Amar Rav Shesha Bered Rav Idi, Kukiane Asire. Okay, now we're going to talk about, this is actually going to a little bit connect back to some things we saw about the trephot earlier in the chapter. So remember we talked about how things get to different parts of the body, right? It was almost a lesson in biology or physiology, like how things work in the body, right? There's the 2 pipes, and each one leads, right? One is the digestive tract and one is the breathing tract. And the breathing tract basically leads to the windpipe, leads to the lungs, from there to the liver, as opposed to the gullet, which is going to send food basically to the digestive tract, which is the innards and the stomachs and all that. So now, Rav Shesha Bered Rav Idi says, Kukiane Asire. If you have bugs that get in, or creatures or something, worms maybe, that you find in the liver or in the lung of the animal, it's forbidden. My taima, me'al ma'atu, you assume they came from outside the body. Okay? So this is like, it's similar to treifa. You open up the body, you find something somewhere, right? How to get there? So you assume it came from outside the body. Matifla Ravashi. Rashi says, what are you talking about? Ime alma, if it came from outside the body, lishtakhu derech beit hari'i. It should be in the innards. It should be in the digestive tract. It shouldn't be in the, we can go through the windpipe to get to the lungs and the liver. Okay, so that's version number 1 of the sugya. Version number 2 is Ikad Amre, Amar of Shisha Bered Rav Idi, Kukyane Sharu. He actually said they're permitted. My taima, mine gavle. Now, if you say they're permitted, it's because you say they were created, again, this idea of spontaneous generation, they were spontaneously generated inside the animal. And what's your proof? Well, Ravashi now says, Ravashi Pshita, he actually kind of raises a difficulty maybe, because Pshita is usually a question. It's completely obvious what you're saying. Because the al makatu, if it came from somewhere else, right, it's obviously coming from inside the body and was created there. Because how else would it get there? Because the same reason as said before, lishtaku derech beit hari'i. If it came from outside, it would have gone into the digestive tract, and here it's not in the digestive tract. Now, even though both these sugyot seem to say that, one says forbidden, and he asked a question. One says permitted, and he said, "Oh, well, that's kind of obvious." Well, the Hilchata is Kukyane Asira. Actually, it's forbidden. Why? My taima. If we just said, well, how's it going to get there? Well, meinam nayim va'ailele be'usye. Okay, we're going to assume that when the animal fell asleep, they crawled in through the nose, and from the nose it got to the windpipe, and from there it got into the lungs. So he doesn't have to ingest it, right? He could get it in there or digest, where he doesn't have to eat it for it to get in there. There's other ways they could crawl into the body and get through the windpipe and get to the lung. Okay, this reminds of all the sugyas about how the needle got in there. Was it through the lung? Was it through, right? And then it depends where you find it. So it's all that all over again. Okay, Darna de Bisra Asire. Now we're going to talk about other creatures that you might find in an animal. You might find worms in between the skin and the flesh. Okay, if you find worms between the skin and the flesh, so that's not getting there any external manner, in which case we're assuming it was generated in the animal, and you would think it's permitted. But what does it say? Asire, it's forbidden. But to kavre sharyam, but if you find the same thing in a fish, it's permitted. So now we have to understand this. Amarle Ravina li'ime. So first, here comes the guy who said, this is a little disgusting, but he says, right, what I don't know won't hurt me. So Amarle Ravina said to his mother, li'ime, avla liva ana echol. Listen, I can eat this stuff in the fish, so just cover it up for me. Don't let me see them, and I'll eat them, okay? As long as I don't see it, what I don't see won't hurt me. Just don't let me see what I'm eating. Okay, now, right, you could say, thank you, mix them in well, okay? In other words, mix it in well so I won't notice it in my food. Now we have to get back, though, to the first one. That was just to prove that you can clearly eat them in fish, because even Ravina ate them. But now, so these are worms that are found in the skin, between the skin and the flesh, in fish or in animals. Maishna, so Amalei Rav Mishar Shebrei Rav Achal Ravina. He says to Ravina, who actually ate them in the fish, so he says, Maishna Mehadatanya. Why is this different from what it says in this braita? Ve'en nivlatam tishaketsu, or you shouldn't have the nevela of, right, this is in the context of, get this pasuk, what the context, this is the pasuk about shkatzim. Okay, don't eat their dead, right, when they're dead. L'rabot et hadranim shebabeima. What does this come to include? This adds, okay, because you can't eat them anyway. Why is it adding aniv latam tishaketsu? To include these worms that are in the animals. Amarle, so he says to him, hachi hashta. Then he says, why are you comparing? That you're asking me why I'm eating the fish, the worms in the fish, if I can't eat the worms in the bird. If I can't eat the worms in the animal. So you're asking me what's the difference? He says, hachi hashta. But those are completely different. Now here he gives a very interesting answer. Behema b'shchitahu demishtarya. V'hanimiti lo kamayangelu shchita b'isurayu kaiman. If you have a creature that was created, and there's assumption this was created inside the animal, so it's not a sheretz hashoretz al haaretz. But there's a different problem, which is any part of an animal. How do you permit an animal? You slaughter it. Okay. Now we did learn that there's this heter of a ben pekua, right? If there's a fetus inside, then when you slaughter the animal, the animal inside is permitted. Okay, that's permitted by the slaughter, but that's a special limud from the pasuk. But if you have a worm that grows inside, you'll have to slaughter that worm. Now you can't slaughter the worm. And the only thing that permits that worm, since it was in an animal, is shchita. The shchita of the animal is not going to permit that worm that was a separate entity inside it. So you need to slaughter it, but you have no way to slaughter it, so basically it has no way to ever be permitted. Whereas you can start to see the difference between a fish. Fish doesn't need slaughtering. Aval dagim ba'asifa ba'alma mishtari. All you have to do is collect the fish and then you can eat it. Right? You just have to catch it. V'hainu ki kagavlan behetera kagavlan. So when it was created in the body of the fish, it was created in a way that it could be eaten as is, basically. So you don't have to worry about that you have to slaughter it and there's no way to slaughter it. So that's why in the animal you can't eat, and the fish you can't eat. It's a bit of a strange thing, but okay. Now we have two more parts for today, and then we'll finish up. And then we'll finish up with the second. Tana Rabbanan. So now we're going back to this, going to a pasuk in Vayikra Yud Aleph, that same chapter, verse 42. Kol holech al gachon, anything that walks on its walks on its stomach, or b'chol holech al arba, or walks on all four, ad kol marbe raglaim, until all those that have a lot of legs. Okay, it's basically like giving you all sorts of types of creatures. Don't eat any of these. So lechal gachon, if it crawls on its stomach, zenachash. That's a snake. Okay, that comes to talk about a snake. Kol, but why does it say all that do this? Lerabot hashilshul ve'et hadomeh l'shilshul. This is an earthworm or something like an earthworm where it crawls kind of like it's snake-like, right? It looks like a snake. Al arba ze'akrav. That's a scorpion. Why does it say kol holech al arba? Lerabot et hachipushit ve'et hadomeh l'chipushit. This includes a beetle or what's like a beetle, because anything like that is like the scorpion. Marbe raglaim zen nadal. This is a marbe raglaim. This is a centipede, which has lots of legs. But now the language by the marbe raglaim is different than all the others. It says ad kol, until all. What it really meant in the pasuk is from this to this, all the way to that, right? Meaning a range of creatures. But because it's a different language than all the others, they're going to say ad kol comes to include lerabot et hadomeh ve'et hadomeh ledomeh. This one adds an extra. It's not only including the centipede, it's also including anything like the centipede and anything that's like something that's like a centipede. So it gets you a whole step farther. Okay. Now we end with the Leviathan. If you remember, the Leviathan is famous. It's one of these creatures. It's not a Leviathan, a whale, what we call in modern Hebrew a Leviathan, because the Leviathan is not kosher. But the Leviathan, that's this sort of fantastical creature that they talk about, which in the future the tzaddikim are going to eat from the ore of the Leviathan. Okay, we had those sugis all about it. We're now going to learn Tanya Rabbi Yossi ben Dormaskit, Omer Leviathan Dag Tahorhu. This Leviathan creature discussed in the Torah is, or in the Tanakh, is a kosher fish. How do we know? Well, we're going to see it has fins and scales. How do we know it has fins and scales? Shenemal Ga'ava Afike Miginim Taktav Chadudei Chares. These are two different psukim. They're both from Eov, and they're discussing the Leviathan. And it says its pride is its ability to protect itself, its shields, And underneath it has these chadudei chares, these very sharp things which can break earthenware vessels. So what does this mean? Afikei miginim, what protects it? Elu kaskasim shabo. That's what scales are meant to do for the fish. They protect the fish. So this has scales. We see that because it has this protective shield on it. Tachtav chadudei cheres, elu snapirim sheporech behem. Those are the snapirim. They're very sharp, and from there he can kind of attack other animals. And, you could say porech behem, that's how he moves, using the fins. So you see that this Leviathan has fins and scales, which makes sense because if the tzaddikim are going to eventually eat from the ore of the Leviathan, obviously it has to be a kosher fish. And on that very strange note, we end the chapter, Hadron alach elu trefot. You should all feel very proud of finishing this chapter. This is quite a long and a complicated chapter. And here we're going to start tomorrow a new chapter. So what did we do today? We had the klal, prat, klal, and the riboy, all trying to teach the same thing in the end about those 4 categories. 2 are in, 2 are out. I'm not going to go through everything, all that again. Then we had which is satum muslim mifurash, as mentioned in the braita yesterday. From where do we learn explicitly and implicitly that water in a vessel can be drunk without having to check for fins and scales? There are creatures in there that have fins and scales. And we had either the first pasuk or the second pasuk. We had 2 different interpretations. Then we got into all the creepy crawlers that crawl on the ground, or the ones that were spontaneously generated, never got to the ground, and we had all the questions, which we didn't really answer, about when it's considered there's already crawled on the ground, and what's part of this isser, what's not. We had the machloket we had the machloket Shmuel, and those who disagreed, which we didn't have a name, but it was a disagreement about how to read those braitot, about whether if it's attached to the ground, do we view the shretzim that were created in there, that were generated in there, are they as if they were already on the ground or not? And then they'd be forbidden or not forbidden. And then we talked about the ones in animals versus fish, and the need for actually to slaughter them because they grew in an animal. That's a separate issue. But if they grow in a fish, then again, it never crawled on the ground. It's not a problem. Okay? And we ended with the different creepy crawlers that are included in the prohibition. And from there, we ended with the Leviathan, how it's a kosher fish. With that, we finish our chapter, finish our daf, wishing everyone a good day.